Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We got a great crowd today. That's awesome. Welcome to the SMU Summer Research and Entrepreneurship Symposium. My name is Adam Neal. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Engaged Learning, which is part of the Office of the Provost. And this symposium is part of our year-round programming that supports undergraduate research and entrepreneurship. In addition to educational events like this, our office coordinates funding opportunities for students, including the Engaged Learning Fellowship, undergraduate research assistantships, and the Big Ideas pitch competitions. We also operate the incubator at SMU, which provides meeting and workspace training and mentorship to student, alumni, faculty, and staff entrepreneurs. This summer symposium is open to anyone, so if you enjoyed today's talk, please tell your friends and colleagues. We have a few more sessions coming up. In the coming weeks, we'll have talks about arts entrepreneurship, art in the Incan Empire, and sustainability in the fashion industry. So if you're curious about what our office does, feel free to peruse our website, smu.edu/engagedlearning, or if you have any questions, you can email us at, guess what, engagedlearning@smu.edu. I can throw those links in the chat in a second. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Jennifer Ebinger, who's the director of our office, and Camille McCallum, who I believe can't make it today. She's our program specialist for entrepreneurship. So to introduce today's guest is Dr. Dominique Baker, who is Assistant Professor of Education Policy in the Simmons School of Education and Human Development. Dr. Baker's research focuses on the way education policy affects and shapes the access and success of underrepresented students in higher education. She recently received research grants from the American Educational Research Association and the Spencer Foundation. These grants support investigations into the effects of state course-taking policies on student loan accumulation and the possibility of racial gerrymandering in community college districts. Dr. Baker earned her PhD in Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies at Vanderbilt, and she earned her Master of Education and Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Virginia. Welcome, Dr. Baker.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for coming out to chat for a bit. I believe, Adam, you want me to go ahead and start taking over?
Sure.
Awesome. So what the plan is that I will talk for a little bit, and really I want as much as possible to sort of open this up to see what questions you all have about research and have as much of a discussion as possible. So what I'll do for the first part of this is I have some slides that I will share right now, and I'll just check to make sure that making them bigger still works. Okay, can you all see it moving forward? Perfect. So as I was saying, you can see the loveliness of our campus that most of us cannot currently access on my slides, but I will chat a little bit about the work that I do. I will provide some examples of projects that I am currently working on to give you a bit of flavor of sort of education policy work, higher education work, and then sort of equity-focused research broadly. A lot of those buckets are different ways that my work fits into that. And then I'll talk a bit, and in fact, I think, look, I have a slide on this. So really, I want to provide you an overview of sort of the research that I do, but also sort of services or experiences that I have that are sort of related to research that might be of interest as well. And so you're welcome to ask questions about sort of any of these topics. And part of the reason that I sort of say this is because if I have served on a review panel for a grant area that you may be interested in applying to, then even though we don't do the exact same type of work, it could be useful to chat with me. For example, I've sat on multiple NSF grant review panels. And so while I may not know exactly the types of things that you study, I have a pretty good feel for the type of way that I like to see things and other people, the way the program officers work at NSF. So that is one way that could be useful for y'all. So basically, I try to throw out there that even though I do research that may be completely different than yours, if there are ways that you think that I could be helpful, please let me know. So I always say this, and so I left it in, that you should feel free to reach out to me to get coffee, definitely on me. If you want to chat further, we are in the middle of a pandemic. And so what I will say is that I am up for virtual coffees with folks, and I will probably like send you a gift certificate to somewhere so that you can purchase some of your own. So you get the non-pandemic experience of chatting with me if you would like to. Okay, so after sort of setting this overview, I thought it'd be useful just to give you a quick frame of who I am. So as Adam very nicely highlighted, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's of education and student affairs practice in higher ed, both are from the University of Virginia. I am a native Virginian, but even though I live away from Virginia, my friends always jokingly say that I am sort of like an embassy. So anywhere I stand is sovereign Virginian soil. All questions about Virginia are also welcome. I earned my PhD in leadership and policy studies, which is sort of colloquially known as education policy at Vanderbilt University at the Peabody School of Education and Human Development. And so all of those things sort of influence the type of work that I do. So I will say that I have for a long period of time, just generally in my life, been curious about better understanding why sort of different people's pathways lead them into different arenas, particularly around education. And part of that has been because I've always sort of felt like certain stories that we tell ourselves are around the choices that people make, right? Somebody chose not to live up to their potential. Someone chose to do X or Y. But I always wondered what the sort of set of choices are that we give different individuals in our society, and whether or not there were systemic or structural ways that certain people get one set of choices and other people get a different set of choices. And so that really inspired me through my educational experiences as well as my professional experiences. So I am a former assistant dean of admissions at the University of Virginia, where I worked for sort of selective admissions for a lot of students, but in particular focusing on students who are the first in their families to go to college, who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who are students of color, and sort of trying to help those students with thinking through whether or not the university made sense for them and other options. So all of that sort of curiosity that I had and my professional experiences lead me to my current role as an assistant professor of education policy. As mentioned, I study higher education policy. And one of the big things, the reasons that I mention this is because you're going to hear as I talk through some of the work that I do, I am particularly interested in interacting with policymakers and policy stakeholders about my research. So it's not enough for me to conduct research and have it published in a peer-reviewed journal. I need to then think about how do I communicate about that work to people that can actually do something with that work. So that could be a staffer for a senator or a representative. That could be individuals who work at think tanks in DC or in Austin who are trying to wrestle with really perplexing and challenging questions that need research and evidence to try to think about what the best solutions are to move forward. And so I have to think about what are the ways that I can communicate the research that I do to those audiences. In large part, one, because often the people that I want my work to be able to impact the most don't always have a PhD, which means that doesn't mean, right, that they are any less intelligent than I am. It just means that there's often in my articles jargon and all sorts of questions or discussions that I may have that are not quite as germane for their needs. And so because of that, I have to try to find a way to translate what I write for those audiences. In addition to that, also, libraries often are sort of the gatekeepers for a lot of my research. And that means that those people actually can't access the articles that I write. So I have to think about whether I write op-eds or policy briefs or other pieces to go along with my research. And you'll hear me talk a fair amount about that as we sort of get into these pieces. So my research agenda broadly focuses on the way that education policy affects the access and success of underrepresented students in higher education, particularly those who are minoritized. And so today I'm just going to give you some examples. My work broadly falls into 3 buckets around campus climate and equity, student financial aid, and affirmative action. So I will go through 3 examples in the first 2, and then 2 and a final on affirmative action on this next slide. So first up is campus climate and equity. So I'm really interested in the physical space, but also the sort of emotive and relational space within a campus, and thinking through how institutional, state, and federal policies can create an equitable and sort of justice-seeking environment. So with that, I have conducted, and these are examples that I hope to try to give you sort of a broad range of the type of work that I do. So one project that I did was on stereotype threat reduction. So this is a project that looked at, it was a randomized control trial or an experiment in a community college in the Midwest, and was looking at, so I won't assume that everyone knows what stereotype threat is. This is a sort of, generally speaking, psychological concept that has expanded into other fields. That says that one of the potential mechanisms through which certain individuals perform not up to their full potential on tests, standardized tests, other types of sort of evaluative assessments, is because of the threat of stereotypes and the threat of confirming stereotypes about identity groups that they hold. So as an example, there are very good research on stereotypes about women not necessarily being as good as men at math. And so if someone sort of primed me to think about that, my womanhood and math, things of that nature, right before I took a math test, there is research that points to the fact that I would, on average, perform worse on a math test. And so because of that, there has been research that tries to look at what could instructors do, institutions, schools do in order to help students be affirmed in the ways that their identity is an asset, is a strength of theirs, and not from this sort of deficit perspective. And so one of the ways to do that is through the intervention that I actually tested at a Midwestern community college. So this means that I, along with some very fabulous colleagues, actually designed an entire experiment, ran it across the entire community college, then did the analysis work, submitted, and that is now published. So the next piece is my student collective action. So that one is sort of what we can think of as sort of like a field experiment, very quantitative piece. My student collective action project is much more mixed methods. There's a quantitative piece, qualitative interviews, and then document analysis as well, looking at student newspapers. And this is all around student collective action and what we colloquially refer to as student protest. So looking at why students choose to get together and protest against sort of racial equity concerns. The protests that we looked at were from around the 2015-2016 time period, but there are a lot of ways, as I'm sure you all know, that these relate to present day events. So we wanted, in order to be able to better understand a holistic perspective on student protest. And so that's the reason that we wanted to do interviews with student leaders, to do analysis of student newspapers, and quantitative analysis of sort of what do we know about institutions that have protests versus institutions that don't. And then the work in progress is something that Adam actually mentioned. So I recently won a Spencer Foundation small research grant to study community colleges. And what I'm particularly studying about them is that an easier way to think about this is that K-12 schools have sort of attendance zones. Sort of says that if you live in this neighborhood, generally speaking, you should be attending this certain high school, middle school, those types of things. So we call those attendance zones. Community colleges actually have something similar to that, which is a service area. So some states say that a given community college is supposed to think about serving this county or this group of students, this neighborhood of individuals. In the K-12 realm, there's been research that shows that the way that those boundaries are drawn for who attends which school have some evidence of what we consider to be in political science gerrymandering. So that there's been a political process done in order to create what would not be considered a naturally occurring group of neighborhoods for who attends a certain K-12 school. So my interest in that is seeing what evidence do we have about how the boundaries are drawn for service areas for community colleges, and whether or not the way that those are drawn is related to racial segregation at the community colleges that those different neighborhoods would enroll in. And so I'm doing that, looking at a case study of Texas. I'm doing that with some really great graduate students and an undergraduate student, in fact, all at SMU, as we look at sort of the geospatial analysis to better understand both the boundaries and then also how that could relate to segregation. So that's an ongoing project that I'm currently doing. We can turn then to looking at student financial aid. And so I wanted to highlight again some examples. So one at the top is repayment. We often talk a lot about how much students, I may not have to tell you all this, but student loans are a big issue of both research, policy concern, public concern, all sorts of facets of that. Along with my equity agenda that I mentioned sort of at the top, is we unfortunately also know that not everyone relies on student loans at the same rate. Not everyone experiences the same ease within the repayment system. And in particular, Black students borrow at the highest rates, they borrow the largest amounts, and they struggle the most in repayment. And that is due to sort of centuries of deliberate policy action from the federal government, state and local governments that has decreased wealth building within Black families. But so that is a thing that's always interested me. So I wanted to better understand that facet of student loans. So these are some projects that get around that. So one is on repayment, which is a case study I did where I interviewed students when they were graduating from an HBCU, all Black students who were graduating from an HBCU. And then I also interviewed them 6 months later for anyone who had undergraduate student loans. You get counseling, this thing we call exit counseling, right when you're leaving college, that's supposed to help you with thinking about how you repay your loans. And then 6 months later is when you actually start repaying your loans for a number of federal loans. And so because of that, I wanted to interview students around the time that they had their counseling, and then around the time that they actually started paying back their loans, in order to see how their thoughts shifted, or whether they shifted around things like the types of jobs these students felt comfortable taking, whether they wanted to go to graduate school, how comfortable they felt with repayment. So that's a project that I did. I also looked within Texas. There's a new goal that the state has called the 60 by 30 Tex plan goals, and one of them focuses on a debt to income ratio, which is how much cumulative debt that students who graduate from public schools in the state of Texas can have in ratio to the annual earnings that they have the year after graduating from college. And so I was particularly interested in better understanding this debt to income ratio, how it shifts depending on things like students' race, students, whether they're the first in their family go to college, those different types of things. So I did an analysis of state administrative data looking to see how these different characteristics of students predicted their debt to income ratios, and trying to see how that shifts depending on the types of institutions that students enrolled at. So that one project, right, is very focused on qualitative interviews with students to really dig deeply in understanding their experiences. The next is more of a large scale quantitative analysis, trying to better understand what's happening in an entire state over 5 different cohorts of students. And then the final one is a study that's in progress. I say it's in progress. It will come out next week or 2 weeks from now. So it's just been accepted to a journal and will be coming out soon. So in progress is a light phrase, I guess. But the point of it is that the federal government created a policy around a sort of low stakes accountability policy for student debt. That basically says if an institution is one of the highest in its sector, sectors of higher education are things like, are you a 4-year public or a 2-year private institution? So it's both whether you're public and private and whether you're a 4-year or 2-year, things like that. But within your sector, are you an institution that had like the highest tuition, or did you have the highest change in tuition over the past couple of years? If so, you get put on this list. It's sort of seen as a name and shame list in order to help provide more information to students, their families, and institutions themselves about what their pricing is relative to their peers. Excuse me. So I conducted an analysis of whether or not that list was actually effective at helping students to attend more affordable institutions, or in changing the sort of pricing behavior of institutions in subsequent years, in order to see whether or not a policy like this is actually working at holding institutions accountable for creating an affordable education. And then the last 2 are around affirmative action and admissions policies, sort of more broadly. This sort of can make sense if you remember that I was previously an assistant dean of admissions. So one piece that I've done is looking at the sort of policy antecedents to state affirmative action bans. So there are a number of states throughout the United States that have at some point banned affirmative action. In fact, California, who previously banned affirmative action, will have on the ballot in November a measure to decide whether or not they will repeal that ban. And basically, part of the reason that people are wondering about repealing that ban is because we have a large body of research that shows that when these bans on affirmative action are introduced, the share of Black and Latinx students and Native or Indigenous students at selective public institutions in the states with the bans just decreases heavily. That's true for undergraduate enrollment. That's true for graduate enrollment as well. So there are these very large impacts when affirmative action is not allowed to be used. And so because of that, I was really interested in better understanding sort of the story behind why states were adopting these bans in the first place, knowing what these large impacts could be. So that's sort of that broader piece. And then the more work in progress part is lotteries for admissions. For any of you who don't follow colleges and universities, I will say that one of our larger scandals before the pandemic made it so that we have one almost every other week was the Varsity Blues scandal a year ago, which embroiled minor celebrities in several different bribery and cheating scandals to get their students enrolled in different institutions across the United States. And so with that, there were calls, there have been calls for decades, but there were sort of these renewed calls looking at creating a lottery system for who gets admitted to highly selective institutions across the United States. And so I, along with a co-author, and several of these other pieces are co-authored, and some I wrote by myself, in case you want to talk through what the different types of mechanisms around research are around that. But I am examining a sort of simulation of different types of lotteries, what they would look like, and what the demographic makeup of incoming classes would look like with these different types of lotteries. That is a work in progress that is currently on hold because I am using restricted data from the federal government, which is in my restricted data room on campus. And so obviously, since I'm not going into campus, I've had to put that project on a little bit of hold until I can get back in there. But if you have questions about sort of restricted data, what that looks like, what data, trying to get data from the federal government or other more difficult to get to sources looks like, we can also definitely talk about that. I will say sort of broadly, so those are the general examples I have. I'll say broadly that I'm primarily a quantitative researcher. So I do things like randomized control trials. I use econometrics a lot. So this is things like instrumental variables estimation, difference, regression discontinuity, fixed effects. I use Blinder-Oaxaca decompositions, propensity score matching, all different sorts of pieces. And I'm also, so I would say that is my expertise. I am also adept at qualitative research for interviews and document analysis. But I try to let the question sort of dictate the types of methods that I use. I primarily also focus on large scale state or national data sets. So these come from the National Center for Education Statistics. That's a huge laundry list of data sets that I use. State administrative data sets, like the Texas data that I mentioned for one of my projects. The census data, political measures as well, since I do study policy sort of writ large. I will also say, I mentioned that I talk about some of the research service that I do. So I sit on 4 editorial boards. So that's an education policy board, a diversity research, equity board, and then 2 generalist higher education journals. And so I spend a lot of time reviewing other scholars' research, providing feedback on that. I also sit on, I've done grant panels for NSF, for the Directorate for Social Behavioral and Economic Sciences, for the Spencer Foundation's large grant program. I've also sat on the National Association for Higher Education Research, which is ASH. I've sat on their Policy, Finance, and Economics section chair for the conference program, which means I also have a lot of experience with, I review for conferences every year, but I've also had experience with actually looking at the reviews and picking which pieces will be published. I also sit on the board of the National Education Policy Research Association. So I, again, have experience with sort of conferences, but also other pieces around what makes an academic association sort of work. And I'll sort of say for the country, I am a national expert on higher education policy and equity. So I sit on different types of working groups. So things like the Lumina Foundation's Borrowers of Color Working Group or the Gates Foundation Post-Secondary Value Commission Research Task Force. So these are spaces where my knowledge of research, both the research that I've conducted, but also the breadth of research in the field comes into play, where I can sort of provide feedback or thoughts, or I can engage with other scholars about sort of big issues and challenges of the day. I have spoken at sort of several different types of convenings around policy work. So this can be things at think tanks. I recently gave a talk at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Board as an example of the different types of groups that I speak to. I also provide sort of expert peer review for think tanks and national research forums like the Pew Research. And that's just, again, where research does not only happen in colleges and universities. research happens in lots of different spaces. And so one of the big sort of critical things that's nice about being an academic is that I am able to sort of help other people by lending an eye on the research that they do and saying like, oh, that makes a lot of sense to me, or, oh, I was wondering about why you did X. So that's a nice piece that I can sort of help to contribute to the larger body of research. And I didn't put up here, but both the affirmative action, the sort of antecedents to affirmative action bans that I mentioned, and the shameless piece that I mentioned, one of the things that I've done is try to, even though they're going to be published in peer-reviewed journal articles, which matters for like, you know, keeping my job and tenure and all those sorts of things. But in addition, I have written sort of public-facing overviews that are quick, sort of 750 word, this is what this research project is about. And I try to get those published with outlets that a lot of policy stakeholders will see. That way they get a chance to read more about my work and those sorts of things. So we can also talk, if you want, about how you think about being a sort of public scholar, how you try to make sure that your research doesn't sort of die in journals. I think that's it for me.
Great. So everybody feel free to just jump in and ask questions, but if you feel more comfortable, I'll be watching the chat. So if you feel better, I can ask questions for you, or if I see themes, I might ask that. But to get us started, I would be curious to hear more about how you navigate this public-facing writing versus journal-centered writing, and maybe something, if you can provide some ideas for students to think about as they get into research, whether it's in academia or not. Yeah, what trajectory for writing and distributing their knowledge?
Yeah. So I think one of the things, there are two different sort of incentive structures you have to think about. The one incentive structure is around, and it matters, is around sort of like your job, what your professional goals are. So for me, as an academic, I have a professional goal of getting tenure, basically of not being fired. And so because of that, I have to publish a certain number of studies in peer-reviewed journals, and my employer cares about which journals I publish in and all sorts of things like that. But that is a thing that I have to do. And in addition, it's one of the biggest ways that other scholars can see my work. So that is a way that I can sort of add to the body of our knowledge and our understanding. And obviously, right, like I think that matters, because I wouldn't sit on as many journal editorial boards if I didn't think that peer-reviewed publication matters. But the other incentives that matter are sort of what you care about doing in the world. And that's not always the exact same thing as your professional goals. And so for me, right, we come back to, why do I do what I do? And I started this with, I'm really interested in better understanding the choices we provide to people. Sort of, if we want to use fancy talk, right, it's around sort of the way that we have structured our society and our country to provide opportunity to people matters to me. And I want to, as best I can, understand the way we've currently structured it and the ways that we could potentially dismantle some of those structures to create more justice across the country, but also the globe. So having said that, that is my goal for my life's work. That's the goal that I think about when it comes to, when I look at myself in the mirror, do I feel that I've done what I need to do for the day? That is not solely satisfied by putting out journal articles. And that's because, as I mentioned sort of earlier on, if I want a staffer, so senators don't read peer-reviewed journal articles. They don't have the time for that. But a staffer, someone at a congressional research office may do that. A thing that becomes really challenging, though, is think about what happens if you don't have access to SMU's library. How do you read a peer-reviewed journal article if you don't have access to Fondren? It actually becomes really challenging, right? That's a problem that a number of the public faces. is they actually don't have physical access to the brilliance that we're putting out in these journal articles. And so because of that, from a very early point in my career, I felt that for every journal article that I put out there, I have to do something else to let people know about the article, to know about the conclusions within the article, the work that I've done, just so that they could even know if they're interested to email me so I could send them the article. So things that I try to do are, I'm fairly active on Twitter. And so generally speaking, as long as it's not too slammed of a week, when I publish a new article and it comes out, I put together a thread on Twitter that I can publish so that people can very quickly, within, I talk too much. I don't know if that's the theme that you're noticing, but within hopefully 15 or less tweets, explain what I did and what my primary conclusions are. Then I also try to write roughly between 750 and 1,000 words of a just very simplistic explanation of what I've done and what I found and why it matters. And that's critical, why it matters. Very often we can sort of feel that it is self-evident why the work that we have done matters with our research. But you have to think that I always try to think from a standpoint that when I'm, and those of you who've ever had me in a class know this, that I think a lot about having to persuade other people. And when I'm trying to do that, then I have to think about what are their time constraints? How much do they feel like trying to read the work that I have done? How much do they feel like, as an example, for one of the papers, I'm writing a public piece on, the method that I use is regression discontinuity. I would not expect that everyone who's currently listening to this automatically knows what regression discontinuity is. So if I write up my public piece and I put regression discontinuity in, I may turn some people off because they may say, this is not a phrase that I automatically know. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do with this. So what I need to do is explain using clear non-jargon words what it is that I did and what I found. And then really clearly saying sort of what is the significance of this? Why does it matter? So I try to do Twitter. I try to do at least one public facing piece. I try really hard if I can to say yes when reporters ask to talk to me about my work. It can be challenging because reporters are under extraordinary time pressures more often than not. Contact you at 9 a.m. and they need to have spoken to you by 4 p.m. And that's really hard if you're already prepping for class and trying to do a research project and also meeting with 3 students. It can be a lot to sort of tack together. So I can't always say yes. But I do try to make an effort to engage with reporters because they are often the people that help talk to the public about my ideas, all these sorts of things that matters for me. So I make it a really large effort to do that. A stealth thing that I also do, and then I'll stop there and let more questions. But another thing that I try to do is every time that I publish a paper, I try to think of 5 to 10 people that I think would benefit potentially from reading my paper. So it could be that I have written a paper that focuses on when I wrote the paper that focused on the antecedents to affirmative action bans, one of the things I did was try to think through who are the reporters that do articles on admissions policies, affirmative action, et cetera, et cetera. And I made sure to email them a copy of the paper. And in the email, I'm very clear. I say like, hey, look, you don't have to read this. It's no sweat off my back. I assume the only person that wants to read every one of my articles is my husband and my mother. That's perfectly fine. But because I know you don't always have access to the articles, I want to make sure that you have access to it. So I do a lot of sort of priming work on my own to try to get my work out there to people so that if they want to be able to engage with my evidence, they can.
Thanks. Who wants to ask a question? I have a few coming in the chat, but I need to digest them for a second first. So, so I say them right.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I actually had a relatively specific question about the work that you did on stereotype threat reduction.
Yeah.
So, in one of my, in an intro to anthropology course, we read an article talking about different suggestions for therapy to help the students who are facing stereotype threat, I think specifically in high schools. But that can come from like performance academically, performance in sports, and other extracurricular activities at the school. And one of the main suggestions was a type of therapy where they take students of groups that tend to suffer from stereotypes that can affect their performance and lead them in discussions. And just that sense of camaraderie and recognizing that they aren't the only one carrying the weight of affirming or disaffirming of the stereotype is supposed to help a lot. I wasn't sure if you'd heard of that or what your thoughts were.
Yeah, so I think part of the thing that's always really challenging, I find, about interventions is figuring out ways to scale them up. And when I say scale them up, so since I do policy work, I'm always sort of interested in larger organizations and structures. So I want to see how an entire university can run a program, or I want to see how an entire state or an entire country can run a program. And so that's one of the things that's always sort of fascinating to me about these pieces is, can we see interventions that work well in the lab? And then how do we find ways for them to be expanded out into field experiments? Because that's sort of where the rubber meets the road. Things in the lab can go really well. They have a protocol to them, all of that. And then you get out in the real world and it is bananas. Like when I say I used to give a talk about the stereotype threat reduction project and tell people I will never do another RCT, I'm not joking. In fact, some of my students who are currently listening to this could tell you I'm not joking. And part of that was because our intervention was a values affirmation intervention, which is a packet that the students complete that's supposed to affirm some of the values that they hold. And it was supposed to be administered in every English class across a community college in the Midwest. But part of the problem, right, is that and we stress and administrators stress, this is a thing that has to happen on Thursday. It has to happen on Thursday. That's the only day that this can happen, et cetera, right? But we still have, at the end of the day, Thursday, instructors who email and say, oh, I forgot to do that packet that you asked me to do. Is it cool if I do it on Monday? And what we have to say, right, is no, we can't do that on Monday. This will just, your class just didn't do the experiment. And so it's really hard. And it's really hard to run that as an experiment, but that's also part of what makes it difficult to scale these types of things up, because that's the same thing that we would expect to see happen if we created a policy across a university to do this. Is that some people comply in different ways than you ask them to, all sorts of pieces to that. So I'm always interested in trying to figure out how we can create these smaller scale interventions that work, how we can then help expand them so that the largest group of individuals can benefit as possible.
Thank you.
So I have a question in the chat that I think is interesting. So what advice would you have for people since you've worked in university administration, people who work in that area who would like to get involved in research but maybe aren't trained in some of the methods that you have been trained in? What advice would you have for people like us who want to get involved in some of this research that pertains to our job and our environment?
I think one of the really nice things is often co-authoring experiences. So if I don't feel, and this is the thing that I have to do as well. I am not trained in every method under the sun. And there are certain questions that would be asked that I don't have the training and I would need help with. One of the nicest things, if at all possible, is if you can find a co-author who has a strength in that area. Because if that's the case, then you all can work together, right? And use your strengths in that way. So if there was a project where in a certain division of higher education, you've got the data and you think there could be a really interesting project, then it's potential, right, that like you could find someone who is trained in those methods to be a co-author on it. And so what would happen is they would contribute, right, the methodological expertise and those things, but then whoever is working within administration, they contribute a ton, right, of practical experience, a deep understanding of how this sort of phenomena work in real life, right? Like not in the textbook. And so I think that can be, I think that there are strengths that both people would be bringing to the project area. So I think that's one nice thing to do, is to co-author. And through that, you may find that you would like to learn more about a certain method or a certain area. And then you can try to think if there are potential sort of professional development opportunities for those types of things.
Cool, thank you.
Sorry, I think Pamela had a question.
I do have a question. Thank you. So I wanted to ask, and I'm just kind of thinking about the question as I'm actually asking it. So trying to formulate it. So I wanted to find out about policy that may not be like quote unquote published policy. So I'm writing around race and culture.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that I want to do in what I'm working on is to be able to, because I'm writing for the general public too. So
Okay.
it's just to help explain to people instances of systemic racism. Mm-hmm. So there's certain things that I can document. For instance, how former slaveholders were allowed to adopt Black children whose parents they had sold, in order to keep those. So there are records and there are laws in communities about that. So I can do that. But then I'm thinking about things like, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but for instance, with World War I soldiers, they were not allowed to be photographed with any dignitaries. And so it was practiced, across the different, military parts of the military, and it's been written about. But is that something that would require doing that sort of qualitative research? If it's something that there's not enough information written about it, and or there's another thing that I'm very interested in where Black soldiers had to tear a corner of their physical paperwork so that the boards within their communities would know who was Black without actually having to know who the person was. And so those kinds of things, I don't know how much is written, like if the Navy sent out something and said, and they could have, don't let this happen, or if we see it practiced enough in different parts of the country, it does practice somehow, what's the word I'm looking at? Does it suggest that there is a policy, whether it is written or whether it is communicated, in other ways? Does that make sense?
No. So I'm gonna put together something, and then if I'm off target for what your question is, just let me know.
Okay.
So I think so sort of like informal policy, sort of hidden rules.
Right.
Yeah. So sociologists do a significant amount of research on hidden rules. I'm off the top of my head because this is the work that I do, but I think about the hidden rules for graduate school, the hidden rules for tenure, right? There are a lot of things that is not written down anywhere that is an expectation and understanding that people have to do. Often, people are trying to do research on those types of things. They're trying to do sort of qualitative interviews. They're trying to look at the actual behaviors of individuals. So like a perfect example of this, when I was in my graduate program and I was talking with a faculty member, they mentioned, I was mentioning to them a concern that some of the female graduate students had around having children while in the graduate school program. And a faculty member mentioned to me that they didn't see why that would be an actual thing. They sort of were looking for evidence. And so one of the things that they said was, well, I tell all of my students that they shouldn't have children while they're, in graduate school, and definitely, not while they're doing their dissertation. So I don't see what the issue is. And so I responded, okay, so you tell all of your students not to have children. Why are only your women students listening? Why is it that your men students hear you say that and still go ahead and have children, but the women don't? So that's an example, right, of a hidden rule that is understood by the women about the caretaking responsibilities and also attending graduate school. So their behavior is showing me what the rule is, even though there's no rule anywhere that's written down. So I definitely think you have to, put in the work, which it sounds like you're doing, to sort of document that this is a sort of, widespread action that's occurring. But you can most definitely make an argument that because of, even without a written rule being down, looking at the behaviors of individuals, and particularly yours is a little different, right? Because going from a historical perspective, right, for like World War I veterans, excuse me, but there are ways that you can document that even though there's no policy, due to the different behaviors, they got that idea from somewhere. This is one of the hidden rules that we have at play.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
Yeah. I just want to throw in before we get to the next question. I had up on a slide, and I want to make sure I clarify this. I mentioned that I do Oaxaca blinder decompositions, but I just learned like 7 days ago that actually it should be called a Kitagawa Oaxaca blinder, because at the same time that Oaxaca and blinder were finding this method that I now know how to do, contemporaneously figured out how to do that method, and no one gives her credit for it. So because I had just learned that, I wanted to make sure that I explicitly say that, because I've decided that from now on, I will be explicitly naming it as what it's supposed to be. All right, next question, sorry.
All right, I got another one. Which of your ideas or studies have you found had the most impact on policy?
So this is what I'll say. My aim is not to have a single study have an impact on policy, because I think a single study is useful. A body of studies is better. So studying student loans at multiple institutions with multiple student groups at different time points, et cetera, it helps us to build a stronger body of understanding and knowledge. And I think that is what I want to see impact policy. So I'm not as interested in like my single study being what someone says, like, this is what told me that I was going to do blank. But my hope would be that my studies in conversation with other studies can inform the way that decision-making is done. So having said that, I don't know. I mean, I have had conversations with policymakers that come from me doing my research, talking to reporters, and being quoted with some things. So that's nice. But I don't know if I could say which one of my studies creates the most immediate impact. It would actually probably be that my work has the most immediate impact on policymakers sort of within colleges and universities. So upper level administrators within colleges and universities, right? We often think when we talk about policymakers about public policy, which is huge and in most of my work, but I also think it's important that we think about institutional policymakers, the people that make decisions on policies within college and universities all the time.
I really like that point because I think that a lot of us think about the one project, and you're talking about how these are a series of studies within an overall project. Trying to think if I could make that into a question, but we have we have about 6 minutes. So anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I have another one. So I am a rising sophomore, and I've been helping, working as a research assistant with one of my professors. And I'm taking a course this fall that is like a single credit hour, and it's meant to help me propose my own research and to find grants that I can apply for that would help me. I'm curious if you have any advice for starting. I will have a professor as a mentor. I'm not going totally on my own, but any advice for starting what would be my own research? And then I'd love to talk to you at some point later about grant applications and all that good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I forgot. So I did, we talked earlier about just sort of research grant applications that I have, but I did apply for and win a dissertation fellowship as well. So we can talk about that because those can be slightly different in some ways because it's more that they're sort of funding you and a project instead of just funding a project. So yes, and anyone is welcome to chat with me about that if they want. Okay, so starting your first research project, exciting. I still remember I was a distinguished major as an undergrad, so I did my own project as an undergrad and then within my master's program. And I think a big thing, I'll say two things. One, read as much as you can and be okay with the fact that you will start to read a lot of things and then feel like there are so many other things that I need to read. It's okay to feel like there are more things that you need to know about a subject is what I will say. So you both want to read voraciously. I 100%, I am a much better writer now. I'm a much better scholar and a much better researcher because I try to read widely. It helps me to think about how I communicate my ideas, my thoughts, arguments. But it also helps me to just think from common sense areas. I was reading a book on sort of higher education accountability and what that looks like in those types of policies. And that's what gave me the idea for the article that'll come out in a week or two. I got the whole idea from that project from reading a book from one of my colleagues, which I emailed them to say thank you. But if I hadn't been reading that book, who knows if I would have had that project idea. So reading widely and trying to read scholarly work, books, peer-reviewed articles, but also trying to read sort of the news of the day. So for me, that's useful because there are a lot of ways that I can read about colleges and universities throughout the United States, both through the New York Times, Washington Post, but also within Texas, the Texas Tribune, the Dallas Morning News. But just trying to, so if it's anthropology that you are really interested in trying to do research in, finding where does the hot anthropology news come in, and then trying to make sure that you're starting to collect and better understand that information for yourself, I think can be really helpful. And then I think a big thing as you think broadly about this is to know that no research project is perfect. Every research project that is published, there's one more thing you could have done. Or, oh, if only X thing had happened, this might go better. So the RCT about stereotypes, if I had a chance to do it over again, I might have tried to add 1 or 2 additional things to help contingent and adjunct faculty members know, to like reinforce again for them to actually do the experiment in their class. That's a thing I can't go back and do. So I deal with what I have, and I provide the best information I can, and I provide the caveats of like, this is what we got. Because I think it's because when you accept that all research is imperfect and all research it could be improved in some ways, I think it makes people feel more comfortable sharing the limitations of their work honestly. And saying like, these are the ways that this work is limited. When we think about generalizing, these are the ways that this work is limited and the impact it could have on X policy for me. That matters a lot to me, because I think when you can be truthful about your limitations and you can be really just like upfront about what your work does and does not say, that's how we create trust in research. That's how we make our work more impactful, because then reporters, the public, policymakers, et cetera, they can trust the things that we say more.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's probably a perfect way to wrap this up, actually, since this is a research and entrepreneurship symposium. You know, it's an ongoing process, all of these things. So every project that you do builds on the last one, and you keep learning. So,
and Adam,
yes,
I wanted to, y'all, I would like to, I'm so glad we ended with this, because it is the process of inquiry and the process of investigation, the process of learning is something that it cycles through every day and throughout your life. And so those of you who are doing undergraduate research right now with faculty, and you want to experience a more independent research opportunity, even big national grants, then we really encourage you to apply for engaged learning fellowships. That's a great way to build a bridge to some of these more high stakes type of research experiences, but it still is very rigorous and it is very independent, and it'll give you a chance to navigate for the first time while you're at SMU that level of independence in your research, a little bit more wiggle room to feel like you can fail or feel like you can struggle. So, I really encourage that as well, because it's a wonderful, wonderful fellowship opportunity. It is capstone level. And so, those of you who are interested in that next step, you should, we'll open up applications, somewhere right around August, early August, but we'd love for you to apply, and you should experiment. So.
Okay, so everybody, I put the link right to the Engaged Learning Fellowship at all the info you need there, but we have a lot of other programs that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Baker, for being our guest speaker today. Loved your talk and your answers. And yeah, everyone, we have these every Thursday, the rest of this month. So please look on our booking system where you signed up for this, and come join us again. See you all next Thursday. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody stay safe.